Hi, everybody, and welcome to day number 3 of the 2020 International eConference on Religion and the Holocaust. I'm so glad that you guys have been able to join us so far. My name is Dr. Darren Slade. I'm president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is the organization that is hosting all of these presentations and has brought all these world-renowned scholars to the table to talk about the latest research in Holocaust studies. And speaking of which, I have a fantastic pleasure of being able to introduce our next guest, Eliot Nidam Orvieto. He is an up-and-coming scholar of the highest order. I'm so excited that you guys get to hear his presentation today, which is on Living with the Order, the Hiding of Jews by Religious Catholics in France. Now, Eliot is currently the Academic Foreign Affairs Coordinator and the Academic Assistant to the head of the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem in Israel. Now, he's involved in different projects at the Research Institute, especially with the Yad Vashem archives involving the rescue of Jews during the Holocaust. Eliot is currently a PhD candidate at Tel Aviv University, where he specializes in the hiding of Jews by Catholics in France. And with that said, I'd like to turn it over to my good friend Eliot. The floor is yours, sir.
Good afternoon, good evening, depending if you're in Israel, and I understand good morning in other parts. And I want to thank Darren and all the other organizers for allowing me to come and share some small part of my research with you today. So let's begin. Okay, during the Holocaust, an undetermined number of male and female Catholic religious throughout Europe, belonging to various orders, congregations, and societies of common life, which now is called Societies of Apostolic Life, opened their doors to those whom the Church had traditionally labeled as being infidels and the faithless. Thousands of Jews were helped and or hidden by Catholic religious in their convents, meaning their residencies, or in their schools or charitable institutions operated by them during the Holocaust. Although there might have been instances and cases in history where Jews were helped by individual religious or by a religious community at times in times of persecution, the opening of religious institutions to Jewish men, women, and children on such scale during the Holocaust presents an unprecedented phenomenon. Research on this topic has primarily been limited to examining the accounts of the rescue action, issues of conversion, post-psychological aspects of hiding, the retrieval of children after the war, or placing the actions within the framework of the hierarchy. Yet one of the topics that has not been given much attention is the daily life of living together of both sides, the two groups of people, Jews and Catholic religious, who were never intended to live together, and in which faith, with the rise of Nazi Germany, the war, anti-Semitic legislation, danger, the search for shelter, but also the desire for resistance, the belief in charity or in corporal works of mercy, as well as obedience to religious authority, brought some members of these two distinct groups together. This presentation will deal with the living with the other, looking at aspects of daily life together and the relationships. So it will look at different things about the relationships together. This lecture will be divided into two parts. The first will discuss some general background details so that we are all on the same plane. And the second will be the heart of the presentation, pertaining to relationships. Of course, as we all know, some relationships are good. Some are bad. They are not always easy, even in the best of times. And this was also the case here. In addition, relationships vary in intensity. Some are very strong. Some are superficial. And relationships also vary in level, such as teachers with students. I have selected some AGO documents, or what I would call quasi-AGO documents from the war period, and a testimony of a sister before Vatican II, which reflects certain themes of relationships that one finds in later testimonies. Now, you might ask, why do I say before Vatican II in regard to testimonies? And that is because if you start looking at testimonies of religious men and women about the hiding of Jews in the post-Vatican II period, the testimonies begin to change after Nostra Aetate. So they begin to reflect some of the thoughts about Jews in a post-Vatican II world. And this is a little bit problematic. And we want to look at the AGO documents to find out what people actually thought at the time, because testimonies do tend to change as people get older and reflect on their situation in their past. Some of the details I wish to mention, I'm going to say throughout the whole lecture the term religious, which here is a noun. It is not an adjective. I am not referring to the piety of the individuals at all. I am referring to those men and women who have dedicated themselves to consecrated life. Now, I will say that my description of a religious is a little bit more broad than one might find in the Code of Canon Law of 1917, which was the code during the war, which did not consider members of societies of apostolic life or common life as religious officially. But I look at how people saw them. If you saw a Sister of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul walking down the street in Paris with her coronet on her head, you would say she was a religious, although the canon would say she is not. So I'm being a little bit more broad here. Another thing is, although religious hid Jews in various ways, hospitals, schools, and private homes of people, I am here talking specifically about those places where you find an intense connection between the Jews and the religious and fathers, brothers, sisters in their residencies, schools, and retreat centers, in which they can build up a relationship more strongly than those in hospitals or those placed in private homes. So what are we talking about? Who are we talking about? And when we're looking at religious, we're talking about who hid Jews. We're talking about both contemplative, active, and semi-contemplative religious, and all the ranges in between, because I've met religious who say they're contemplative, active, and all these. You find them all from all different sets of religious life. Most local convents and institutions hid only a few Jews in their local houses, less than 10. On another hand, you find those that hid up to about 100 within their institution. And then you find those communities that hid more than 100 into hundreds. But these were usually placed outside the religious institution, and although they became responsible for them, and they were placed in homes, etc. And we also must add that not all religious belonging to these groups of orders, congregations, and societies hid Jews, or at least knowingly hid Jews. If you consider how many religious congregations there were in France at the time of the war, in actuality, you find a very low number of those who are actually hidden by religious in comparison to those that existed. Religious did hide Jews in their institutions that were available to them. So if they took care of old people, they hid old people. If they took care of children in schools, they were able to put them in schools. They usually took them according to their apostolate, although you do find them taking in women, men, children, and entire families sometimes. Most religious at the time were largely a majority French in their communities in France, although you do find a few foreign religious in the institutions, but for the majority, they were French. And we have to keep in mind that you're talking about a new breed of religious that were in the communities hiding Jews at this time, that were affected by the society of a pre-war society in which they lived in the 30s and the 20s in which society was beginning to change. Women had more power, women were coming out into the society, etc. And these affected how they saw what they should do. Who are we talking about as Jews in the convents that were hiding? For the most part, if you're talking about adults, they were foreign Jews, meaning non-French native Jews. But their children were often born in France, or they had lived in France since very early age, and most of them were very strong French speaking. Not all Jews stayed in the communities at one time, and they did not stay throughout the entire war quite often. They stayed for a period of months, some to a year, and some did stay throughout their entire period within one community. But you also had a lot of transfers from religious communities to private homes and back and forth. This makes it very difficult for a researcher to understand how many children were actually hidden in religious institutions because of the constant changing and constant moving of those children and adults. And we have to keep in mind that Jews varied in different backgrounds. Some were very strong nationalists, some were socialists, some were communists, all put into the same institution, and sometimes it was quite difficult in that regard as well. Relations. Let's look at some of the issues of relations. Keep in mind, most religious, men and women at the time, male and female religious at the time, knew nothing about modern Judaism. They had absolutely no contact with Jews prior to the actual hiding that took place. Now, you do find some exceptions with Jesuits and Dominicans and the communities of Notre Dame de Sion, in which some members did or had contact with Jews. But for the most part, these were quite rare. And on the other side, most Jews who found themselves being hidden in religious institutions and by religious knew nothing about them, and they knew nothing about the strict and unique lifestyles in which they were about to live in. So let's look at some of the here. We're going to look at our first document. This is a diary that was called Captives in Our Walls. It was written by a sister, Marie de Vin Redempteur, and she was placed in charge by the Mother Superior to take care of the Jews in their community. Now, this was the contemplative congregation of Marie Réapatrice or Réapatrix. They are contemplative sisters, and they took care of a retreat center in which they took in adult Jewish women to hide. And the sister, Marie, you see I put Mother Marie because in this community, all sisters who were solemn professed or perpetually professed were called mothers. So it makes it very difficult sometimes for researchers. Anyway, she kept a secret diary about the relations she had with the Jews and that she was hiding, as well as the relationships that the Jews had with each other. So it provides a very unique document for us. And she wrote it in coded language during the war. One of the things that's about it, why I called it a quasi-document earlier, is because after the war, she translated it into French from her coded language, and then she started to add certain parts. So it's not completely, in all cases, of the document of the time. She mentions a woman named Selma S., and she writes, on the 28th of August, due to the persecution in the south of France, Miss Rode de Neuville brought us a young Jewish girl, an Austrian. She had received no news from her parents who had stayed in Vienna. She only possessed feeble resources and had a nature accustomed to independence. The transition was harsh from all aspects. This bird, deprived of liberty, did not find the gilded bars of her cage hospitable. I have the impression of being in an asylum of crazy people, she would sigh. It is necessary to confess that this new milieu, nothing fit the atmosphere that she was used to. But then, what a newness for a soul, without any belief, to find an atmosphere of contemplation and prayer. Kindness was the only way to soften the exclusion of this poor, sympathetic child. And one of the things you see automatically is the sister realizes that confinement is difficult for these women who are staying there, not just for Selma, but for all the others. Confinement is a problem. And I have a strange feeling in my that she was used to people coming to visit the convent who were not used to a contemplative lifestyle. So she would have understood that a confinement would have been difficult for any of those people. And I think that's why she realizes it from the very beginning. Another thing you find is the woman, the sister, is very understanding of the suffering that the girl is experiencing. And you find this throughout the entire diary, that the sisters are understanding of the suffering that those who were hiding in there with them were facing. And they tried to find ways to connect. Now, Selma loved novels. She was addicted to novels. And she had a real difficult time of mending the gap with the sisters because the sisters did not read newspapers, they did not listen to radio, and they certainly did not read novels. And they had many discussions about how they did not read novels and these kinds of literature. And Selma had a real difficult time of understanding what kind of person am I living with that cannot read a newspaper or a novel. So the sisters found a member of their community that knew something about literature, and they would bring her and talk to her. So they had some kind of base to communicate. And another thing you see is that the sister is realizing that religion is important, at least from the sister side, and that even though she is not going to say anything, and the reason why I say she's not going to say anything in this case, this community, the mother general, made a rule that no one is to talk about religion to these women, at least publicly. They are not allowed to talk about Catholicism, and the Jews were not allowed to ask anything about Catholicism. They were only to appear Catholic. And the reason why is because they said if a question got asked that somebody should have known the answer beforehand, then it could destroy the false identity that they were living under. So they said it is a sin against prudence to talk about religion. So religion became almost not heard of while they were doing it. However, hiding in a religious institute permeated the institution. Everywhere is religious. The prayers, the bells, the statues, the pictures, or whatever. So it permeated everything. And we have to keep in mind that at this time, the sisters really would have wanted the Jews to convert, even though they might not have wanted to say so, or could not have said so, because of extra ecclesiam nulla salus. There is no salvation outside the church. So they would have wanted it in themselves, and they saw it in the environment. And when the person picked up on it, then they were able to initiate it. And this happened with a woman named Madame Rauch. Rauch. Yeah. Now, Madame Rauch had a 5-year-old son. He was hiding in Toulouse. She did not know where. And when the Germans came in, she went basically hysterical. And the sisters could not deal with her. They tried everything to deal with her and nothing worked. So they finally were able to convince her that what she should do is to pray to the Virgin Mary, because Mary will take care of her. And one day, Mrs. Rauch saw a picture of Mary. Now, we don't know if it's this one. I just picked this one because she saw a picture of Mary of Sorrows. Now, this is the Mary of the Seven Dolours. So it could have also been the head of the picture of the community. It could have been Maria Patris, a picture of that, or it could have been Mary at the cross or something. But she saw a picture of Mary suffering. So she began to see this woman as herself. She said, this is a Jewish woman who knows my pain. She had a son that died. My son is in trouble. She knows me. So the environment became a relational aspect for this woman. And she connected to the sisters, and the sisters connected to her through the environment in which she found herself. Now, one of the things we have to keep in mind is these are adult women. And one of the things you find is that some of the women could not stay here. They were tired, they were frustrated, they wanted to get out, they wanted to know about their families, etc. And some of them left. Now, Mrs. Walker did not leave. In fact, the sisters actually found the child and brought him to her for a few days so she could see her son, that he was okay. And again, we see them suffering because they see this poor child. Now, one of the things we have to go on is relations with the adults versus children are very different, because adults could leave and not deal with confinement, whereas children, when they were placed in the school, was confined. So you had them sometimes leaving, which made the sisters very anxious about the danger. And so at the moment, I want to switch to children so we can understand a little bit about children. We can go back to adults in the question and answer period. One of the statements here, we're going to look at the testimony of a sister. This is why I mentioned of the pre-Vatican II testimony, where she talks about which kind of Jews she likes and which ones basically she has issues with. And she talks about Salome, who was very superficial. She struts like a rooster playing the Grand Duchess. I seem to remember that she didn't want to do any housework, and you can see it on the screen. She didn't want to clean up, etc. So she finds her very frustrating. And then she talks about Olga. Now, Olga, she mentions in a different light. Olga was much more interesting, very attached to her religion. She was proud to be Jewish. She often found when she would go out, she would put her hand over her chest where the star basically was, so that she could feel proud. And what you see with Olga and the sister is Olga talks to her about religion, because Olga is a religious Jew, and it connects to the sister because they have something in common now to talk about religion. So the sister talks about when they would go from one building back to the convent in the evening, Olga would talk about God, and she would talk about the sky, and she would talk about the heavens and God, etc. So the sister had a relationship built up with her because of the religious aspect. Then the sister, in her testimony, refers to the others. And she says the other ones are quite irrelevant. The Jewish religion or any other wouldn't matter. And she mentions that the only concern they had was for food. And she mentioned how they talked about how they had chickens and they had fruits, etc., at home, and how they were suffering basically now. And she goes on and talks about Olga, how Olga meant something to her, and how her prayers go for Olga, etc. So you see the connection between the religious and the secular. Now, one of the things that she says, and you find it differently in other testimonies, I must say is the issue of food. Although she would have considered the fact that the food is not important, and these did, other sisters find food to be very important when it deals with children, where it's just difference of testimony, because they point out that the children did not have enough to eat. And it is true that children were always talking about food because there was not enough food in the alimentation cards during the war. And quite often, the sisters had to search for food, or the brothers or the priest had to search for food to give extra to the children because they were hungry. And this is being missed in the testimony. But why I bring it is you see a difference of opinion. And one of the things you do find in other testimonies is that religious Jews are often treated differently by the religious who are in hiding, those who are in hiding by the religious. And if, for instance, if the Passover and they needed matzah, you find many communities trying to get hold of the underground to get matzah, or to only supply eggs, which was a commodity that was almost impossible, or potatoes, to help those Jews maintain their kashrut during this time. So you have a very mixture thing of wanting to convert, at the same time respecting the religiosity of those who are religious. This does not mean, however, that they would respect it for everyone, as we know that many of the sisters gave all the children pork to eat and things like this during the war. Another thing I want to mention is that relations were not always the best between the two from the very beginning. We have some cases where a child is taken to the convent and the priest says, do not baptize the child. This is a Jewish child. And the sister or the brother said, this child has, and they quote, mortal sin. And therefore the child must be baptized because he cannot enter the convent or in the institution until he's baptized. So they saw it as a sinful person. We have other cases where, for instance, a child is brought with, she's just been left from her mother, taken from her mother. She goes to the convent to be hidden, and the sister says, welcome, and the child